Thank you, Dr. Tracy Ledger, for making yourself available. I'm just going to basically introduce you to the topic. Dr. Tracy Ledger is going to be speaking to us on the topic, who controls what? The political economy of our food system. Very quickly, I'll provide a brief background about Dr. Ledger. Dr. Tracy Ledger holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of the Witwatersrand. She is a senior researcher at the Public Affairs Research Institute, which is affiliated with the University of the Witwatersrand. Dr. Ledger has undertaken extensive research around local government, focusing on the drivers of institutional performance. She has also undertaken research extensively on South African food system. Dr. Ledger, welcome on board to the Food Dialogue Summit. It is nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Very quickly, I'll just ask you some questions about the food system, and I want you to share your opinion about them. The first question I have here is that who holds power within the South African food system?
Well, I think if you have a look at the food system, it's very much dominated by the retail sector. So the value chains in the food system are mostly buyer-led value chains, which means that when you have a look at what happens between the farm on the production of food and where the consumer actually accesses food, those retail food chains are really dominated by the buyers, which are the big retail sectors. You get a slightly different arrangement when you look at lower down and you look at inputs into farmers and food production. But certainly we have very powerful retailers. We also have quite powerful processors in terms of the power that they can exercise over especially small farmers, but the dominant power in the value chains lies with the retailers, with the buyers.
Okay, thank you very much. The second question is that why have food prices so high and profit margins of some actors or some stakeholders within the value chain so low within the food system?
I think there's very little hard and fast empirical evidence to say exactly who is making a profit in the food chain and who isn't. But what does the empirical evidence tell us? Well, the empirical evidence tells us that the gap between the farm gate price of food and the retail price of food has widened extensively over the past 25 years. So what we see is that farmers have a smaller and smaller share of the final retail price of food. So typically the farmer would get only about 30%, for example, of the price of a liter of milk. So the terms of trade for farmers have definitely declined. We've seen a lot of farmers, especially small-scale farmers, going out of business. But at the same time, we've seen that processors and especially retailers are making good profit out of the food sector. We also see that consumers are losers in the system. 80% of South African households can't afford to buy a nutritionally balanced basket of food. So there are definite losers in the system, small-scale farmers and consumers, and definite winners, which are all of the retailers and some of the bigger processors.
Oh, okay. So in a way, are you saying that basically around food price increases that retailers and processors, they benefit most from their food price?
It certainly appears to be that way. I really think that what South Africa needs is a detailed grocery market inquiry, so that we can unpack all of these things in a public forum. And I think that a lot of us in the sector have advocated for some time that the DTI needs to instruct the Competition Commission to convene a grocery market retail inquiry, which will unpack exactly those issues. What exactly happens between the farm gate and the retail shelf on basic food?
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now talking about the pandemic, precisely the COVID-19 pandemic, how has the pandemic affected power relations within the system, within the food system?
I don't know that they have fundamentally changed the power relations within the system, except for the fact that the demand for food has definitely declined. People are buying less food. And what we see, what the initial evidence suggests is that that burden is being carried disproportionately by farmers and the processors. Even a big company like Tiger Brand says they're feeling the negative impact of the declining demand for food. But retail prices have been going up. So I think it's not so much that the coronavirus pandemic has changed the power relations in the market, but what it has is it's possibly made those power relations more visible. And definitely what it has made visible is the negative implications of that disproportionate allocation of power, and especially in the ability of consumers to access affordable food, even when the price to farmers is declining.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So apart from the power relations, where we can see some changes or some more visibility, or basically getting to understand better now that the retailers and processors, they basically have the power in the system. What other sort of changes have you noticed within the system that the pandemic has brought within the food system?
I think what happened is that obviously the pandemic and the lockdown was very bad for the informal sector and informal traders of food. The informal sector is especially in urban areas. And in South Africa, hunger is predominantly an urban issue, simply because there are more people living in urban areas. There are a lot more hungry households in urban areas. And the informal sector is absolutely essential to the ability of those households to feed themselves in a cost-effective way. Most notably because prices of items like fresh fruit and vegetables tend to be lower in the informal sector than in the formal sector, but also because the informal sector operates at a walking scale. So it saves people the cost of having to travel to buy food. And that cost is a very important transaction cost when you've only got a relatively small amount of money to spend on food. So I think that's the main thing that it did. And of course, then that has a knock-on effect on the system, because if people that are working in the informal sector selling food can't do so, then their income and their ability to access food is also compromised. We also need to remember that there are very strong linkages between the informal sector and the small-scale farmer sector. So more than half of what is traded on the Joburg fresh produce market goes into the informal sector. And the vast majority of suppliers into the fresh produce markets are small farmers. We must remember that the big retailers, except on a couple of occasions, the Spars and things like that, but the big three, Woolworths, Pick n Pay and Checkers, they don't buy anything from fresh produce markets. They have their own vertically integrated supply chains and their own category managers. So small farmers really rely on the informal sector and the small formal sector, local groceries, greengrocers and that, for their turnover. So when we shut down the informal sector, we not only deprived consumers of access to food, what we did is we deprived a great deal of small farmers from their access to market.
Those with power and money, what have they done in response to the pandemic? And how might their actions or inactions change their relationship with the society in the future, beyond consumerism in the future?
Yeah, well, not so much and not so much, I think. I would say. I mean,
okay.
I think that obviously, there's lots of charity and corporate giving and that, but charity doesn't change the system. Charity doesn't change power relations. Charity makes people with money feel good about themselves.
True. So finally, I want to ask, when you look at the South African food system, what sort of change is happening or is not happening within the system? And how can we ensure a more equitable food system in South Africa?
Look, I think the only way we're going to have a more equitable food system is if there's a conscious effort to redesign one. And I think it's a lot of that comes down to the way in which we understand the problem. The way in which you understand the problem, the way in which you define the problem fundamentally determines where you look for a solution and how you frame that solution. So to date, what we've done in this country is we've framed hunger and inequitable access to food as an individual problem. It's because people are unemployed or because they don't have enough money or whatever. We've never specifically included the systemic issues in our analysis of the problem. And hopefully what we've realized now is that what we have is a serious systemic problem. I know that the DTIs referred to it as market failure. It's not market failure. The market's working perfectly. The market is working the way it's supposed to work. This is how a vertically integrated, retail-dominated supply chain works. It extracts value from the other participants in the chain for the benefit of shareholders and the company. It's not a question of market failure. It's a question, a much more fundamental question. It is whether this commodification of food, whether or not a system where profit is the only reason to determine whether or not someone has access to food or not, is actually the kind of system that this country needs. You know, and I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to say, no, it isn't.
All right. Thank you very much for your contribution.
You're welcome.
It has been nice having you on the summit. And I hope that the deliberations and the engagement will continue further.